Hello to you good friends in Fellowship 345. We're going to have to stop meeting like this in the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, but welcome to you. I'm recording this in the early morning. The birds are singing, the sky is blue, the sun is strong and warm. Sorry to tell you that. I want to take you on a conducted tour, the normal tour that we would give to all of the people who come here in their hundreds of thousands a day sometimes. So please follow me, and I'm going to show you the first site that is possibly the place where Jesus was crucified. Come this way. So here we are at the possible site of Jesus' crucifixion. And in a moment I'm going to explain 5 reasons why the crucifixion may have taken place at this location. But first of all, listen to part of the gospel events as Prue reads them to you now.
The soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him with 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek.
So let me give you 5 reasons why this may be the place of the crucifixion. So I hope you've got your fingers ready. Point number 1. We know that Jesus was crucified outside the walls of the city. Just over here to my left, 200 yards away, is the current wall, north wall of the city. It's been in the same location ever since the time of Jesus. So that's point number 1. Point number 2. When the Romans crucified people, they always did it alongside highways. And we've got here the intersection of 2 major highways. One going north from Jerusalem to Damascus, and the other one going east to west from the Mediterranean Sea down to the Jordan Valley. It's such an important crossroads that we've even got a bus station immediately next to us, which is where all of the noise is coming from. Point number 3. This area here, the flatland, was known before the time that Jesus was born. It was known as Beit HaSekila, which means the place of stoning. The Jews were using this area for stoning people to death before even the time that the Romans came here. So, this was an accepted site of execution. In the view and mind of a Jewish person, it was unclean and defiled. If the Romans continued to use this as a site of execution, then the Jews who lived over there in the city would have made no complaints at all. Point number 4. The cliff behind me, which is a quarry face, has been compared to the place of a skull. We know that Jesus was crucified at Golgotha, the place of a skull. And for a couple of centuries, the front face of this cliff has looked like the features of a skull. Have a look at this photograph from over a century ago. And as you look at it, you can see the eye sockets and the bridge of the nose and the features maybe of a skull shape here in the picture. You look at the cliff face and compare it to the photograph, and you can still see some of the outlines there in the cliff itself. Of course, we've got 2 problems. The first is that the part that is the bridge of the nose between the eyes has collapsed somewhat. There was a very severe frost 7 years ago, and it doesn't look now quite as the photograph looks from more than 100 years ago. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that the photographs of this hillside from the time of Jesus have been lost. So we've no idea what it looked like 2,000 years ago. It may have looked like this recently, but we can't say what it looked like in the time of Jesus. So is this the place of the skull? Well, it may be, because point number 5 is that close by the place where Jesus was crucified, this is what the Gospels tell us, close by the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden there was a tomb. And I'm going to take you into that garden and show you what was a working garden, an agricultural garden, a vineyard in the time of Christ. Have I shown you the authentic place? Historians and archaeologists would want to argue with me and say, no, definitely not. Others would say, it seems very convincing. But what you know is what I know, that much more important than precisely where Jesus was crucified is precisely why Jesus was crucified. And over that, there is no debate at all, because Jesus told us in his own words. He said, I have not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. That was what Jesus did somewhere close to here. If not exactly here, then where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands, which is less than a mile away from here. So we are as close as we're ever likely to be to the exact spot where he was crucified. And that's his explanation of why he was crucified. Now we understand ransoms because they're still being paid in our own day to day. Evil men, they kidnap somebody, they keep them imprisoned, they make them their captive, they won't let them go until money changes hands. When Jesus paid your ransom, and he paid my ransom, it wasn't with money. He didn't reach his hand into his pocket and get out his wallet and check to see whether or not he had brought enough money with him in order to be able to afford us and look to see how much he'd got with him. It wasn't his wallet that he opened in order to buy us. It was his veins that he opened. And he paid for us with his blood. He paid for you and for me with his lifeblood, not because you've been good enough or I've been good enough, but because we can never be good enough. He did it not because we are worthy, but because we will never ever achieve that level of worthiness. That is the deep, deep love of Christ. But there's one more thing from this hillside that you won't see anywhere else in Jerusalem, and this for me really stands out as a helpful point. Look again at the front of this cliff and ask yourself the question, if it was a quarry, and it was an exhausted quarry even before the time of Jesus, why had they stopped taking stone from the front of this cliff? And the reason is that the stone that remains is rubble. It was no good for the purposes of building. The quarrymen said, this is useless, we can't use it anymore. Jesus picked up a verse in Psalm 118 which said this, the stone that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. If it's true that Jesus was crucified here, somewhere down here where these buses are standing, and that hillside was the backdrop to his cross, he wasn't crucified on the top of the hill. There's nobody going by up there. You put a sign over his head saying Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, and nobody passing by on the highway would be able to read it. If he was crucified here, it was with that hillside behind it, and then that makes that verse of particular significance. The stone that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. Jesus was crucified for the crime of blasphemy. The people of his generation said, this man is useless and the things that he's preaching are rubbish. We need to get rid of him. Today, Jesus is the central figure of the human race. 2.6 billion people name him as their Lord and themselves as his disciple. And I'm one of them. Since I showed you Golgotha, the possible place where Jesus was crucified, I've now walked through the garden and we've come to a wine press. I said to you before that that was a known site of execution. There isn't any debate about that. There isn't any debate about this having been a working garden in the time of Christ. What is behind me is a wine press. You only put a wine press in a vineyard. This one is Roman style. It was rediscovered by archaeologists in the 1920s. You can see at the back that there is a kind of channel that would have allowed the grape juice to come down into this basin and then down to the bottom into the trough. There's another platform that has not yet been excavated that is under the ground. So what we are able to say is that without any doubt, there was a place of execution, a known place, that here we are in a known garden, a working garden, an agricultural garden, and in this garden there is a tomb. The tomb that you are going to see is like the tomb of Jesus in 8 different ways, and I'm going to run you through them. I hope that you've got a pencil and paper so that you can take the notes down, because I'm going to give you a test on this in November when I get back home. So let's go from here down to the tomb and see the similarities between this tomb and the tomb of Jesus. So just before we go to the tomb itself, I'm going to ask Prue to read another portion of Scripture that gives us an introduction to the burial and resurrection of Jesus.
Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. Now at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there.
So then let's go a little closer to the tomb. I said to you that I've got 8 points over here by the tomb. Point number 1 is that we are in a known garden. Jesus' tomb was in a garden close by the place where he was crucified. Point number 2, his tomb was closed with a rolling stone. I've got one here, just behind me. This one's authentic, it's ancient, but it is too small for the tomb that we've got here. But this is exactly the kind of coin-shaped stone that would have been used in the time of Christ. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, the tomb that we're going to look at now was chiseled out from solid rock, living rock. The tomb that they had for Jesus was not a natural cave that they looked at and they said, oh, well, this will do, we'll pop his body inside here. This one had been made with hammer and chisel over a long period of time. So that's point number 3. Point number 4, the tomb of Jesus was the tomb of a rich man. Only somebody who was very wealthy would be able to afford to have a tomb of the size that you are going to see made for him. This would have taken months to do, and to pay the workmen in order to do it would have required a lot of money. So that's point number 4. Come and have a look. Point number 5 is that the tomb of Jesus was a Jewish tomb. This has always surprised me, and yet it's so obvious. Joseph of Arimathea was a senior Jewish political leader. He was one of the members of the Sanhedrin. If he built a tomb, it was going to be according to Jewish custom and Jewish burial practices at the time. The practice was what we know perfectly well. Jesus' body was wrapped in perfumed linen, it was laid on a ledge, and it was left with the intention that it was going to rot. If you do that, and you want to be able to go in and out of the tomb again, then you need some way of being able to draw off the unpleasant smells of a decomposing body. This is a Jewish tomb, and it's got a ventilation shaft, and that ventilation shaft would have drawn off all of the smells as the body decomposed. Jesus was buried in a Jewish tomb. Point number 6. On Easter morning, Luke tells us that there were 5 women, at least, maybe 6 women, who came to the tomb and went inside it. Luke names 3 of them. He knew who 3 of them were. One was Mary Magdalene, the other was Joanna, the other was Mary, the mother of James. But then he says, and the other women. So at least 5, maybe 6 women. And he describes the way in which they went inside the tomb. They didn't stand outside, although the stone was moved away. They went inside. So Jesus was not buried in just a little hole in the ground. He was buried in what must have been a substantial tomb chamber. And that's where we're going to go. So come inside with me and see what the tomb is like. We've come inside now into the weeping chamber. This is where the body would have been prepared for burial. It would have been washed, anointed with oils, wrapped in linen, and then laid it one of the burial ledges on the other side of the tomb, in the burial chamber. So I'm in the weeping chamber, that is the burial chamber. Luke says that 5 or 6 women came inside. You are able to stand up inside this tomb. There's plenty of room for everybody. So that's point number 6. Now, point number 7 is this. After the women had been here to the tomb, they went to find the men. John describes what happens next. He said that he and Peter were so excited at the possibility that the tomb was empty that they came running to see if it was true. John says he ran faster than Peter did. And he says he got to the entrance to the tomb and he crouched down and he looked inside. Now, the entrance to the tomb at that time would have been half the height that it is now. In order to come inside this tomb, you would have to come in on your hands and knees. And what he describes is this. He says that he crouched down at the entrance to the tomb down here and he looked inside. Now, if he did that, the only one of the 3 grave beds that are here that he would be able to see is the one on the opposite side. He couldn't have seen the one on the right, and he couldn't see the one in the middle because they would be out of his eye line. But he says that he could see the one over there on the left-hand side. As he gets closer and closer to the entrance to the tomb, what happens? Well, his body shuts out the natural light. So the question then is, as he gets to the entrance to the tomb and he looks inside, how can he see whether there is a body there or not in the gloom? The way that he can see is because this is a Jewish tomb, and because it's a Jewish tomb, it has got a ventilation shaft, and the ventilation shaft lets in light into the inside of the tomb. This is the kind of tomb that Jesus must have been buried in. Point number 8 is this, that if you come inside this tomb and you look for a dead body, you're not going to find one, because Jesus is risen. And that's the message that we proclaim here. Just as I said over at the site of Golgotha, the possible site of Jesus' crucifixion, much more important than precisely where he was crucified is precisely why he was crucified. Over here, much more important than where Jesus rose from is why Jesus rose. Let me take you back out into the sunlight again for a moment, and I'll explain 3 reasons why Jesus was raised by God the Father. So I gave you 5 reasons over there why that might be the site of Golgotha. I've given you 8 reasons over here why this may possibly be the tomb of Jesus. But at the end of the day, where is irrelevant. What is important is why. The Acts of the Apostles is very specific, and so are the epistles, very specific, that God raised Jesus from the dead. He did not raise himself. Jesus had said to his disciples, I have the power to lay my life down and to take it again. But in the resurrection, he did not take it again. He was raised by the Father. The Father raised him for a whole host of different reasons, but let me give you 3. The first one is this. Mao Zedong, the former leader of China, was a dreadful man and is recognized now as having done enormous damage to the people of China. Millions died under his premiership. What the Chinese say about Mao Zedong today is that he was 70% right and 30% wrong. Jesus taught many things. Some things people find hard to believe and hard to accept. Were they true? Was he right? When God raised Jesus from the dead, he guaranteed that everything that Jesus said, everything that he taught, and everything that he did was absolutely 100% right. Not 70%. We can take a bit and leave a bit, but 100% right. If Jesus had been a fraudster, if he was taking people for a ride, if he was mentally unstable, if the things that he taught were not dependable, then what would God have done with him? He would have left him in the grave. God authenticated the teachings, the life and the ministry of Jesus by raising him from the dead. We can have absolute confidence in the things that he said and taught and did. So that's point number 1. Point number 2. over there, where we were looking at a known site of execution, we talked about Jesus paying a ransom for us. Now, evil men, they receive ransoms being paid today. They get the money, they look at it, and they say to themselves, you know, I could have got more than that. I'm not going to let this kidnapped person go until I get another payment. When Jesus paid our ransom, did he pay it in part? Just 50% of it. So he pays 50%, and we're left with another 50% to pay. I've got to try my best to be a better person. I've got to pursue holiness. I've got to try to become a righteous person. Is that right? He does 50%, I do 50%. Or maybe he did 60% and I do 40%. Or maybe he did 90% and I do 10%. When Jesus paid the ransom, he paid 100% of the debt that I owe. And how do I know? Well, people answer that question and they say, oh, well, it's in the Bible. I'm afraid that won't do. It's not good enough. The evidence that the ransom has been paid in full and accepted by the Father is that God raised Jesus from the dead. It was his stamp of authenticity. It was his stamp that the payment has been made in full, right there on the bottom of the bill. Paid in full. Once in my life, I had a bill, and on the only once, and on the bottom it said FOC. FOC? It stands for free of charge. Jesus paid it all. He didn't pay it in part. He paid it entirely so that I might be forgiven, so that I might have a relationship with God, and so that my destiny might be secure. So, the resurrection, God raised him from the dead, authenticating his teaching, authenticating the ransom, and one last thing. The stone that was in front of this tomb was moved, not in order to let Jesus out, but in order to let the disciples in, so that they would know that Jesus really had risen. It wasn't an empty tomb, remember, because the grave clothes were still in there. It was just that Jesus had gone. He is not here, he is risen. And the wonderful thing about this Christ is that we might know him and live with him and experience him wherever we go. So that's the story of the garden. At the end of our presentations, almost every time we invite people to consider the fact that this garden is a garden of decision. It's a place where we can meet Christ for ourselves. And you know, the wonderful thing is that people leave this garden day by day in tears, and many come to Christ week by week in this place. They meet him for themselves. And so, friends, back home in Fellowship 345, I want to invite you, as you visited the Garden of Decision today, to ask yourself the question, where do I stand with Christ today? Make this your prayer. Jesus, I open my life afresh to you. I want you by your Spirit to come and live within me and to keep me company day by day throughout the future until I meet with you face to face. Amen. God bless you.